Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Blood, Guts, and Social Commentary. Today we're going to take a look at gender equality in horror. That's right, I'm going to talk about gender equality in horror and why people seem to not believe it exists. The old stereotype is you're going to have a skinny, probably blonde ditzy girl doing dumb things and somehow maybe outsmarting the killer. It seems like after Wes Craven died, any horror site that was worth their weight in salt wrote some kind of article about how he was this great feminist director by having Sidney in the Scream franchise and Nancy in the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise. So while this idea isn't quite as weird as it used to be, there's still a lot of people that just don't believe women are treated well or equally in horror film. Most of the websites that wrote articles about this use the term survivor girl or final girl. These ideas were brought forward in films like Behind the Mask: Rise of Leslie Vernon, Cabin in the Woods, and the film Final Girl, and the other film Final Girls, one's plural, one's not. And while yes, I totally agree a survival girl or final girl archetype exists in horror, I think this is an oversimplification, and I believe there are a lot more categories, and having a girl last to the ending credits is way more common than people really do give it credit for in the genre. We're going to discuss 4 different categories for this. The first one I'm going to deal with is the very commonly used survivor girl archetype. With any archetype, there are rules that form it. A survivor girl is only going to kill to attempt to escape the situation. She's not going to just go around murdering everybody because she can. She is also the most willing to go back for people, and when somebody in her group dies, she is going to take this momentary pause where the action kind of stops, and we have to kind of suspend our disbelief that the killer's not going to keep coming after her, and she has this moment of grief and this moment of guilt that she couldn't fix it and save somebody. Examples of this are littered all throughout horror and didn't necessarily start with Craven, even though he did do them debatably the best. In Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the character of Sally survives the entire ordeal, gets in the back of somebody's truck, and is just laughing like a maniac. And the assumption is it's because she has just undergone this insane trauma and stress that is going to shape probably the rest of her life. I don't want to say the word PTSD, but yeah, she's probably going to have some kind of level of that for the rest of her days. While she's laughing like a maniac, Leatherface is just throwing a tantrum with his chainsaw. This implies not only had the family done it before, because we've seen the remnants of them going after other people, it implies Sally was the first to survive. So it means no matter how many groups they went after, the group we were familiar with, everybody died except for her. And this happens a lot in horror. I would say maybe 99% of horror movies have either a girl that survives to the end solo, or if a group survives, there is always one woman left, unless we have a total party death situation, and then all these points are moot. A kind of cheating example of this is the Slumber Party Massacre franchise, which was written and directed by women. They also always had a male attacker going after a group of women. So it's cheating because if somebody survives, it had to be a woman because most people involved in the situation were women. It's also important to note this franchise was meant to be a spoof on the horror genre and a just big joke at it, but it was taken and received more as a straight up horror film, and it still seems to be viewed that way today, so it's completely valid. Up until the 90s, a big part of the survivor girl archetype was also that she had to be virginal. This got destroyed in Scream when the famous horror rules scene was put out. As Randy stated, no sex. Sex is a big no-no. During all of this, our main character of Sidney is upstairs losing her virginity to her boyfriend. Not only does Sidney lose her virginity and become a theoretical target for the slasher, the character of Gale Weathers, who also survives through the franchise, is referred to multiple times as a whore, implying she has fairly promiscuous behavior sexually, and she does not seem apologetic for that at all. Since then, this focus has kind of shifted and this rule isn't so concrete anymore. When we look at a movie like Behind the Mask: Rise of Leslie Vernon, it still kept the virgin rule, because horror at its core is based heavily in puritanical values. You screw, you die. The reason for that is you can't enter the gates of heaven if you've had premarital sex. It's just the way it is. Which is really funny when you think about it, because we're talking about a very moral, religious-based standard governing this gory and heavily sexualized genre. It's even pointed out in Leslie Vernon that the girl is probably going to go grab a weapon. 9 times out of 10, it has some kind of phallic shape to it. They refer to it as being, quote-unquote, empowered by cock. But to be totally fair, most weapons that are going to give you any kind of reach or range are phallic-shaped because they're long. If you have a killer coming after you, you don't want to have to be right next to him to kill him. So something like an axe or shotgun is a much better ploy than something that would be closer range. Since the virgin rule is kind of dying out as the years pass and just generational shifts and cultural norms have changed, we either have it dealt with in a very strong, heavy-handed way like Scream did, or we have it dealt with more subtly. The character of Mary Beth Dunstan, who survives all through the Hatchet franchise, is referred to at one point as poor white trash, which means odds are she's a little promiscuous. But it doesn't matter because her sexuality is in no way, shape, and form related to the goal of killing Victor Crowley. While she is attractive and a few sexual advances are made towards her, she rebuffs them. It's half because it's really inappropriate to try and hit on somebody when everybody is being threatened and the realistic possibility that people might die is on the table. But also, when you're running from some kind of weird being that keeps coming back and trying to kill you, yeah, getting naked and having sex is a pretty bad plan. We see this in Hatchet 2, when 2 people are having sex and Victor Crowley kills the guy coming up behind and then kills the girl because they're naked, they're vulnerable. Pretty much any sexual position isn't conducive to getting up and running after the fact, or being able to get up and fight. Because, again, you're exposed, everything's out there, and it's just a movement issue. This can also be dealt with passively in our next archetype, which is the mother. The mother we assume has sex because if she is a biological mother, that's how babies are made. I'm sorry if I'm breaking that to you. I'm kind of hoping I'm not, though. There are instances like Laurie Strode from Halloween or Jill from When a Stranger Calls, where it's a babysitter watching over children, where, yes, they can be totally virginal there. Laurie Strode, that was established pretty heavily. Jill, I can't remember off the top of my head, but I'm pretty sure she was virginal as well. But biological or not, this archetype is completely based off a lioness protecting her cub. Anything that comes near that child, biological or not, she will destroy. She only kills to protect her child. She doesn't, again, go around killing for no good reason. She also tends to do this alone. This is why a character like Mary from the Purge films isn't included in the mother archetype, since she had the help of her husband, her children to some extent, because her children weren't super young, and the bloody stranger who was never named in the film. She actually fits into the survivor girl archetype and not the mother archetype, even though she is a mother. Having children by blood or not does not necessarily mean you fit here. The big tipping point is having to do things solo. An example of this tipping point and some of the morality that comes into play here is Donna in Cujo and the mother in Child's Play. Both of them are dealing with a situation where they can't get any help or assistance and they have to defend their child by themselves. In both instances, there's also almost a punishment for misdeeds. In Child's Play, the mother refuses to believe her son when he tells her the doll's acting weird. Now, to be totally fair, if you're a parent and your kid's telling you, hey, this doll's acting kind of funny, you're probably not going to believe them. You're going to assume overactive imagination, the kid's having fun, and it's just bleeding into what they think is reality. Which, in this case, she takes damage and she has to defend herself against Chucky, so we can consider that almost penance for her disbelief of her child. The same thing can be said for the film Cujo. The mother is having an affair, which would totally destroy her family and rip her child's life apart. Yeah, it's overdramatic, and I'm not saying I agree with these ideas, but I am saying there is this idea of retribution for those that disbelieve their child or put their child in any kind of threatening situation, which from a puritanical standpoint, her getting divorced, having sex with a man she's not married to while she is married, adultery is a big deal. Like, they don't like it. So she has to deal with Cujo on her own as this life-changing event and a way to take stock of her misdeeds. Another very literal example of this is the film Inside. Sarah is a widow, so she has to defend herself on her own. She does have people come through and almost try and help, but they aren't there from the start of the situation, and most attempts have been unsuccessful by them. This also, as I mentioned in another episode, leads to her killing her own mother by accident because she just had a fear response and stabs her in the neck, which, while Sarah's pregnant with a child, her killing her own mother has some symbolism and definitely has some impact. Sarah does have this almost Survivor Girl-esque reaction to the death of her mother, where she just keeps crying and exclaiming, "I killed my mother, I killed my mother," and it takes her a while to recover from that. But then that maternal instinct takes over and she realizes she has to save her baby. In the end, we find out that the woman that is attacking her lost her child when Sarah got into a car accident with her. Sarah didn't miscarry, this woman did, but this was also the accident that took Sarah's husband. So while both of them suffered losses, the attacker feels that her loss was greater in the loss of a child, and she wants penance from Sarah by taking her baby. So not only is this a mother defending a child, this is also based heavily in reality, because this unfortunately happens a lot where women have these, it normally ends up being the result of a hysterical pregnancy, where they will end up stalking and stealing somebody's fetus. It's terrifying. There's also another metaphorical branch to this, besides a babysitter or a literal mother. In the movie Candyman, the character of Helen is getting her doctorate, she's studying urban legends, and she's specifically focused in on the legend of Cabrini Green, which is a housing project, and they have this metaphorical defender of the ghetto called Candyman. Helen goes a little too deep and angers the restless spirit of Candyman because, of course she does, it's a horror movie. During her research, she befriends a woman named Anne Marie that lives in the development and is sort of passively willing to help her out a bit. Helen at one point wakes up in Anne Marie's apartment covered in blood and having a knife. She hears Anne Marie screaming. Helen comes out to realize Anne Marie's dog is decapitated and her baby's missing. So, of course they're going to assume Helen did it, because why wouldn't you? At the film's climax, we get a massive bonfire being set in Cabrini Green. Helen hears a baby crying, and she is the only one to hear this baby crying. It's Anne Marie's baby. She climbs into the pyre and saves it, giving the baby back to Anne Marie and sacrificing her own life because she's horribly burned, which is another big part of the mother archetype. She will sacrifice herself and die if she has to save the life of a child. At the end of the film, Helen actually almost takes on a Candyman-like persona as being a defender of this area, and theoretically playing mother to the entire complex of Cabrini Green. Another time we get this is Nightmare on Elm Street 3, where Nancy returns. While Nancy does have kids behind her, she is getting help, but at the same time she's kind of not, because she has to defend these children. Her life will always be spared for these children, which ends up happening when so Kristen can live and become the new Survivor Girl of the franchise. So Kristen is a Survivor Girl, but Nancy's a mother. Nancy also reappears again, depending on how big of a purist you are with the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise, in Wes Craven's A New Nightmare, where she played herself with a child. But in that one, she didn't have to self-sacrifice like she did in 3. Yeah, she took damage, but she didn't die. Now, if you're wondering why I haven't mentioned, debatably, one of the biggest horror mothers ever, that's because she fits in a totally different category. Jason Voorhees' mother, while yes, a mother, is not in the mother archetype. She is in the female killer archetype. While yes, she feels she's avenging Jason's death, she isn't killing the counselors that caused his death. While Jason died while 2 camp counselors at Camp Crystal Lake were off having sex, if Mama Voorhees had just killed the counselors that were off having sex while Jason drowned and all the other counselors that should have been paying more attention, she absolutely would fit in the mother archetype, but she doesn't. She just kills any attempted counselor at Camp Crystal Lake. And I say attempted counselor because the camp hadn't opened yet. The important thing to note with a female killer is she's gonna act almost exactly as a male killer would, it's just a gender reversal role. This was done kind of for cheap shock value of, especially in Friday the 13th. One of the biggest grievances fans had with that is we see clearly male hands killing the entire time, and at the end it was, oh no, it was Jason's mother. It was never Jason. That was a little hard to buy. But there are some times where the act of killing isn't gender neutral. In the film Ginger Snaps, Ginger is bitten by a werewolf, and the reason she's bitten by a werewolf is she has received her first period. Why, yes, she can argue everybody bleeds and blood attracts werewolves and they're obviously gonna bite anybody for some reason. The fact that it was specifically menstrual blood is an exclusively female thing. The transformation into her becoming a werewolf is mistaken for puberty, because phrases like hair where there wasn't hair before, that gets used across gender lines and is a part of puberty for everybody. The fact that it's also established that Ginger's cycle is syncing up with the full moon when she would become a werewolf. Most women actually do get very, trying to think of a nice way to say it, sexually aroused around the time they're about ready to start menstruating, because that's when you're at your most fertile. And Ginger even comments that she mistook originally her impulses to kill as an impulse for sex, showing how quickly those lines can blur. A more gender-neutral example of a female killer comes from the August Underground franchise. This focuses around a heterosexual couple, male and female, that are also serial killers. And we've seen this kind of idea before between the male and female partnership. We saw it in like Bonnie and Clyde, Natural Born Killers. We also see it a little bit in the Saw franchise, when Amanda takes the reins, but the characters in August Underground are an interesting addition to this for the sheer fact it's an abusive relationship. It's an unhealthy relationship. There's no two ways about it. You're gonna go around killing people. Yeah, you probably have some issues, and you're probably gonna have some issues with whatever relationship you somehow find yourself in. But there's never a feeling of the female character being coerced into killing, which tends to be the way that these things go. Either there was an incident that spurred her to kill, or there's some kind of male influence that caused her to want to. And while, yeah, I get people being uncomfortable with the idea of gender equality through two psychos murdering people, it is really a step in the right direction, because their relationship is equal. They are equally abusive to each other. They are equally as bad of people to each other. And they both seem to love killing equally. A nice little offshoot of this franchise is also the female child killer. Now, child killers themselves are probably just going to warrant their own episode, but there's a specific branch off with the girls. When you look at a film like The Good Son or Mikey, where it is a boy killing, it typically is written off as boys will be boys. Not the killing itself, but the interest in the morbid. When you have a boy expressing interest in death or the macabre or something gross, we really do as a society write it off as, oh, boys will be boys. If a girl expresses that interest, it is dashed very, very quickly. I can speak from personal experience on that one, but in movie world, it is just the same way. If we look at a film like The Bad Seed, Rhoda had to be incredibly manipulative. She never could express her interest in death and killing. She had to hide behind this absolutely perfect little girl image, which adds a lot more depth to the character. So not only do we have this horrible idea of a child being willing to kill somebody, we have it with a child who is highly intelligent and highly manipulative. These traits have to develop quick and early for us to buy a small, sweet little girl is gonna kill somebody. And while female child killers don't have as many entries into the child killer genre as boys do, with movies like The Exorcist, Alice Sweet Alice, and The Reaping, they have made a pretty big mark, and they always seem to get a little bit more attention just because we really as a society don't think women kill at all. The fourth and last category in this is the revenge killer. This is a woman that only kills in the film people that are directly related to threatening her. She's not a survivor girl because she typically needs to act alone. She's also not a mother because she's not defending a child. This is a female killer that is typically steeped in some kind of sexual assault. Films like Last House on the Left, I Spit on Your Grave, and Hard Candy are really good examples of this. Hard Candy did put somewhat of a spin on this idea, The character of Haley is very young and meeting a much older man at a coffee shop. As an audience, we make the immediate assumption that there is going to be some kind of assault on Haley by this guy. They talk about things that they've talked about online. It's kind of obvious he seems like he's grooming her. And she wears this red hoodie that kind of gives this whole big bad wolf idea. The coffee shop they meet at also has several flyers about a missing girl. So there's obviously some kind of problem in this town that's already recently happened. So her doing this action right after seems like a kind of sketchy idea. They go back to his place, cause of course they do. He attempts to pour her a drink. She does, well, we learn in school, we're never supposed to have a drink that somebody else mixed for us. She mixes him a drink, he passes out. We flip what would have been the standard male on female sexual assault narrative to her assaulting him. She's actually had complete control of the situation. She always intended to go back to his place, and she played as the willing victim. The reason being is the posters we saw originally in the coffee shop were that of her friend. We see this kind of idea again in the movie Death Proof, when Stuntman Mike tries to run a car full of women off the road because, well, they're not threatening because women, they beat his ass. There's no polite way to put that. They kill him. They chase him down and kill him. The same happens to an extent in the film Eden Lake. Jenny loses her fiancé pretty early in, and while she's a school teacher and you can tell has a maternal instinct, she gets to a point where she has no issue killing those kids. The kids that are harassing her, the kids that cost her fiancé, they're all gonna die. Only the ones related to the situation though. She doesn't go after people that are not a threat to her. She also does do the Survivor Girl thing when somebody dies. She does have that moment of mourning, but it tends to be at the loss of a child, and you can tell she feels bad and guilty still because social norms dictate you don't kill kids. Hindbrain, we gotta keep the species going, gotta keep kids alive. But at the risk of her own life, she just decides it's not, that social moray just isn't worth it anymore. As I pointed out earlier, most of the time at least one female tends to make it to the end credits. Why is that? Let's all think back to the urban legend of the hook hand killer. A boyfriend and girlfriend are in a car, they're making out, there's probably gonna be some kind of intercourse. Girl hears a noise, refuses sex, until the boyfriend goes out and checks the noise. This idea and this notion costs him his life. And that still seems to be the way it is in horror movies. If we're talking about the standard group going into a woods dynamic, where odds are gonna have an almost even split between male and female. This is done for the obvious hooking up purposes. If it is an odd number though, it almost always is a guy who's nerdy and no one will have sex with him. Meaning, if most of the group dies, it's gonna be mostly men. And now I know what you're saying, oh my god, well they just put women in there as decoration to die? Okay, let's be fair here. It's a horror movie. Most of the characters are attractive. Even the quote-unquote ugly nerdy guy is somewhat attractive. Everybody's there to die. It's not just an exclusively male or female thing. Everybody's there to die unless we set up a killer who has a gender-specific killing. Typically isn't the case in a slasher. The only thing I might give you that is maybe a little misogynistic in horror movies is if we have a group of survivors, odds are it's mostly male, maybe one female. The issue with that is it doesn't make sense, because if we're talking about an apocalyptic scenario, you need more women than men, because once a woman gets pregnant, she's kind of out of commission for 9 months. Plus, women can only have so many babies before they just can't have them anymore. It just damaged their insides too much. So if we're talking about repopulating in an apocalyptic type scenario or survival scenario, which our brains tend to go to anytime our lives are threatened of, it might as well be the end of the world because it's the end of our world. I can give you that comes off as a touch misogynistic. But in horror films, guys are more than willing to put their neck out on the line for a girl because they know girls will keep the species going more than they can. It might not be discussed, it might not be on the surface, but it's always there. Guys always have a bigger body count because they're the ones willing to go check out the funny noise. Now, as I said earlier, yes, horror tends to be steeped in pretty puritanical values and pretty puritanical ideas. While those are not the most pro-women things, we have to look at that building block through the lens of the more modern director who probably doesn't dislike women, probably thinks those ideas are stupid. Look at Wes Craven. Look at the whole virgin rule dying. He was a modern director that went, hey, that's stupid, let's stop. We also see this in The Revenge Killer when a woman is assaulted and forced to do things she didn't want to do sexually. She gets her revenge. Both of these films, some of the most notable scenes in them are ones that involve the removal of the male member to ensure that this guy never does it again. We see a lot more male genital mutilation than female, or it's at least like 50-50. But the overall impact of scenes, most people remember that bite down, spit out in Last House on the Left, and most people remember that bit and I spit on your grave. With the bathtub and the knife and her convincing these idiots that she was into it. Another reason I'm just pretty convinced horror is not nearly as misogynistic as people make it out to be is because if you haven't gathered at this point, I'm a lady. If you haven't gathered at this point, I like horror. If you haven't figured it out by now, I'm a lady who likes horror. I've been to conventions, I've been involved in the community. There's a chance I just got lucky, but every convention I've ever been to, every forum I've ever been a part of, I was treated as a fellow fan and not a fellow female fan. One of the problems with nerd culture in general and its portrayal always seems to be that a female horror fan, gamer, comic book reader is treated as almost this mystical unicorn. So the pop culture and seems to be the cultural idea of what happens when a quote-unquote nerd guy meets a quote-unquote nerd girl is that the guy either fawns over her completely because, oh my god, she has similar interests, or that she's treated as you couldn't possibly be a fan because you're a girl. Here, let me ask you all these weird questions and completely dismiss you because elitism. To be fair, I've had the guy attempt to do the super hard trivia to, weed out the poser, but that guy was meta-nerding with everybody. It might have been a little worse with me, but that's such a small percentage of the population. Also, no one likes that guy. Like, meta-nerds don't like meta-nerds. So I wouldn't even count that. Because it's like, why would I count this tiny little thing over here against my entire experience in the community? When I'm looking at a group of people from different backgrounds, different jobs, different races, different circumstances, different socioeconomic levels, and the only thing that really puts us all together is horror, and I almost unanimously get a feeling of gender equality where women aren't singled out, but women aren't praised either, which is exactly what equality frickin' is. And the only line tying us together is horror. It seems more like it's a causation instead of a correlation. When you step back and look at the genre as a whole and you see all of these women that didn't get help, didn't really need help, or just fended themselves, or were protected by the man, and when all the men folk died off, they're just like, oh, I'm gonna fight this now. Because even when all the men die off, and even when we have a big body count that's dudes trying to protect her, she still stands up at the end. Why? Because if she didn't, it'd be boring. You get a group of people that all buy into this and all enjoy seeing that idea. It kind of makes sense that there's gender equality and respect within the horror community towards women. They've seen women hold their own time and time again on film. Why in the world would that be an issue? Thank you for listening. If you like what you're hearing, please like, comment, subscribe. If you don't like what you're hearing, you think I'm wrong, please feel free to leave a comment. I love feedback. Thank you.